Good evening. I'm Melanie Ramey, the chair of the Madison Committee on Foreign Relations, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this first event of our 2021 season. We have an exciting season lined up for you, and I think that you'll be pleased as I mention some of them. One of the things that we've, of course, had to all do is get used to having virtual meetings. And I will say to you that it has had a really positive side for us because we have been able to get some speakers that very likely we would not have been able to have in person, simply because of the fact that if a speaker does not live in Madison, it's really a 2-day commitment. By the time they get here, would meet with us in the evening, go back home, and sometimes that's not possible in the schedule of very busy people, or that it can't get on the schedule that we have. So this has enabled us to really attract some very outstanding speakers, and of course, that certainly includes this evening's speaker, which I will come back to in a minute. But I did want to mention that the rest of the speakers for the spring are now on the website and call your attention to it. Our next meeting will be on Monday, March the 16th. At that time, we will have with us Dr. Richard Lang. Dr. Lang is a former medical doctor with the World Health Organization and also a retired professor at Boston University in the Department of Global Health. And he's going to talk with us about the World Health Organization capability, the capabilities at the present and the possibilities for the future. As you know, one of President Biden's early executive orders was to have us rejoin the World Health Organization, of which we had been a member forever, practically. And so Dr. Lang will really help us understand the capabilities of the World Health Organization and what some of the future possibilities will be. Then in April, we're going to welcome Ambassador Mark Greene. Ambassador Greene is now the CEO of the McCain Institute on International Leadership. He is a former ambassador to Tanzania and was the administrator of the USAID program until last August. And Ambassador Greene is also from Wisconsin, and so we'll be happy to see him again. And then in May, we have May 10th, Professor Aaron Rock Singer, who is a historian of the Middle East. And he is going to talk with us about the challenge that Egypt faces with the rise of Islam in the contemporary age. So we have a variety of programs lined up. I think they all are outstanding. And I certainly want you to put them on your calendar and plan to be with us. I know that this evening, many of you are with us because you know our speaker. Our speaker is our former Senator, Russell Feingold, and he represented us very ably in Congress from 1993 until 2011. And there he was known, I have to tell you, as a man of conscience and a patriot. And in fact, he has received the John F. Kennedy Profiles in Courage Award. This was a person who was the only one actually to vote against the Patriot Act. He was one of the first opponents of the Iraq War, and he's been long opposed to the death penalty. So in any event, we are happy to have him with us. He's been with us, of course, since he was born here and grew up in Madison or Janesville and around Madison area. And he was in the Wisconsin legislature as a senator for 10 years. He is a graduate of the university here. He was a Rhodes Scholar and also a graduate of the Harvard Law School. And since last year, about March, he has become the president of the Constitution Society. And this is a very interesting organization, and maybe he'll tell a little bit about it, but they are really to create, are interested in creating public awareness, advocacy, and support of progressive as they are interested in entering public service in the field of law. So I think that it's another interesting job for him. It's a wonder he had time to view this evening, because not only is he doing that, he lectures frequently around the country at different schools, and particularly at Stanford, Harvard, Marquette, and wherever they want a wonderful speaker. He also, though, has become more and more concerned about the whole area of biological biodiversity. And he is now the ambassador to the Change of Nature organization. And this is an organization that is really trying to get countries to commit to preserving 30% of the land and the water of the planet by the year 2030. And so this is really like a new deal for nature. And there will be a big conference in China later this year, which I'm sure he will be there. But he has been very concerned about what is happening in this area. In the Obama administration, he served as the envoy to the Great Lakes region in Africa and also in the Republic of Congo. So we couldn't ask for a person who is more passionate about this topic and more involved in it. And so I will now turn our program over to Senator Feingold, who will talk with us about the challenge of an environmental crisis and the threat to biodiversity. Senator Feingold.
Thank you so much, Melanie, for a very, very nice introduction, and Ron for kind invitation. I can't see everybody, but I'm pretty sure a lot of good friends and former supporters are there, so I say hello to you, thanks to you, and looking forward to talking to you about this subject tonight. What I worked out with Ron is that what I wanted to talk about, because you're involved with foreign relations here, is an environmental issue that, of course, is of international in scope. And as Melanie said, it's about the problem of biodiversity, or others call it the extinction crisis. And so that is the topic. And I'll try to relate it to our current politics, the international situation, as well as the changing scene in American politics now with the new Biden administration. So just, how did I end up getting involved with this? I think it's a slightly interesting story, because I was not destined to become somebody working on international environmental issues, given my background, the subjects that I worked on over the years. Although I am proud of the work I did on the environment, I was not sort of an expert. For me, growing up in this state, like for many of you, conservation, as it was called when I was a kid, and then environmentalism, as it came to be called, was sort of a no-brainer, being from Wisconsin. Of course, one of my predecessors in the United States Senate was Gaylord Nelson, the founder of Earth Day, who was known to work closely on a bipartisan basis with Warren Knowles, a former governor of our state, in conserving great areas of Wisconsin for future generations. And the whole idea of environmentalism was pretty new when I was a teenager, at least to the general public. I grew up in Janesville, and we had a river running through the town, the Rock River. And the Rock River was considered a yucky place. Like, nobody would go near it. You wouldn't swim in it. It was considered polluted. It was considered dangerous. The Rock River was basically considered bad. And so they even decided in Janesville, and my dad was a wonderful man who cared about the environment, but Janesville decided to put a parking lot over the river, right in the middle of the central intersection in town. They put a parking lot right over the river. That was the attitude, until, as you know, things like the Cuyahoga River catching on fire, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, and others began to help raise a consciousness in this country, and led by people from Wisconsin, people like Aldo Leopold and Sigurd Olson and others, who really got us to think in different ways. So, as I think about my teenage years, of course, it was a civil rights movement, Martin Luther King, opposition to the war in Vietnam, the beginnings of the LGBT movement, at least the modern part, the women's movement, and yes, the environmental movement. And I was at Janesville Craig High School in 1970, 50 years ago, when the first Earth Day occurred. And they sent us outside to pick up garbage on the campus. And of course, Gaylord Nelson, who was our senator at the time, was the inspiration for this internationally. And so when I was a freshman at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 1971, as I was running around, in those days you didn't register for courses online. You had to run around like crazy and come back to the red gym, as many of us remember. Well, the most active group around the campus were people trying to sign us up to be part of WISPR, the Wisconsin Public Interest Research Group, which was an advocacy group inspired by Ralph Nader regarding the environment. So when I entered college, the environment was a big deal. Of course, this had a great influence on me. And so years later, when I was lucky enough to become state senator from the rural areas, primarily around Madison, but part of Middleton, a little bit of Madison, I was in the legislature for 10 years. I was not on an environmental committee, but my voting record was part of the so-called Clean 16. Spencer Black and others would know what that is. The legislators that voted, right on the environment, and then there was the dirty dozen, the 12 members of Congress that are of the state legislature that were not good. And then what really started to influence me was starting in the 80s, about 1987, my mother suggested that we go up to a place called Madeline Island in Lake Superior. And I had never even been up there. And when I took that corner in Bayfield and you look out at the Apostle Islands, I went, oh my God, is this Wisconsin? I said, this is one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. And I fell in love with the Apostle Islands that are now known as the Gaylord Nelson National Lakeshore. And the whole idea of wilderness, the whole idea of preservation of natural areas became something that really was personal to me in many ways. But ultimately, I got interested in it from a public policy point of view. And this comes from a family where, we didn't go camping. My father's idea of camping would be, go to a little hotel and maybe go to a supper club. We didn't rough it. And so I had to sort of learn about those things later in life, and I came to really enjoy them. And when I was in the U.S. Senate, thanks to many of you, I occupied the seat that Gaylord Nelson used to have. He was defeated by Bob Caston, and I defeated Bob Caston. So I knew that I had an obligation to work on these issues. In the Senate, though, even though you may not be on the committee that's relevant to it, unlike the House, where you pretty much have to be on the committee, in the Senate, anybody can bring up anything. So when McCain and Feingold did their campaign finance bill for 8 years, neither of us were on the relevant committees. That's the way the Senate works, and it's one of the great powers of being a senator. So I realized that in addition to bipartisanship, I could participate in environmental issues, and I founded what's known as the Wilderness Caucus, which was a group of Republicans and Democrats together, basically following the inspiration of the great Aldo Leopold, Sang County Almanac, of saying, look, there's some places that are so critical that we have to preserve them, not just as national parks, but as wilderness areas. And so we have the Wilderness Act in our country, and we were able to broaden the places like the Boundary Waters and others that have significant areas that are completely free of development, such as wilderness areas. We also saw a connection between environmental and fiscal responsibility issues. Because a lot of the big federal government projects that were pushed by some of the big powerful interests in the country, mining and others, were really things that cost the taxpayers a huge amount of money, or in some cases, they didn't pay their fair share, such as mining royalties and others, getting away with murder. So we combined the environmental impacts on that with the fiscal impacts. And then for our own region, I was instrumental with Governor Doyle in passing the Great Lakes Compact, which has to do with making sure that our waters in the Great Lakes can't be taken by other parts of the country without our having some role in it, and the need to strengthen the Clean Water Act. And in those days, unlike now, generally, these often were the most bipartisan issues. It was not, people weren't attacked for working with the other party on environmental issues, like we used to have in Wisconsin. So how would I get connected from that work to international work on the environment? Well, it happened through a different route. I was on the Foreign Relations Committee. And for 18 years, I was the senator most involved with Africa. And, there were a number of other senators on the committee who knew that I worked on that. One of the person's name was Obama. Another one's name was Biden. And the third one's name was Kerry. So these are good people to know that you care about Africa. And they sort of saw me, of course, I wasn't the expert on many of the issues, but on this one, to the extent anybody spent real time in Africa, I was pretty much the only one for 18 years. And so after I left the Senate and I was teaching at Stanford, the Obama administration did ask me to become the Special Envoy for peace negotiations with armed groups in Congo and Rwanda in that area, not with a focus on the environment. But interestingly enough, the name of the job was the Special Envoy, as Melanie said, to the Great Lakes region of Africa and the Democratic Republic of Congo. This created a little bit of humor because one of my supporters in Tennessee called me up and said, "Congratulations, what are you going to be doing? Measuring water levels in Lake Michigan?" I said, "No, this is the other Great Lakes," which I didn't even know the term when I went to the Senate. So an idea that I came up with, along with another Wisconsinite, her name is Susan Hednett. She was the EPA director for the Great Lakes region of the United States under President Obama for many years. We were having dinner in Washington and we thought, well, is there some way we can bring together the need to protect the Great Lakes of the United States and North America with the Great Lakes of Africa, which of course includes some of the most impressive lakes in the world, Lake Victoria, Lake Tanganyika, and others. And so we came up with the idea of creating a Great Lakes to Great Lakes conference, which we held in 2015 on Lake Tanganyika for 4 days, where we had experts from Canada, the United States, and Africa working together, comparing things like invasive species, climate change issues, sanitation issues, overfishing issues, the potential of tourism. And so that was very exciting. And so that's sort of how I got a little bit more involved in those issues, trying to connect it with the need to basically say to the African countries there, if you can get this violence to stop, there's a beautiful environment here that you could really benefit from, what sometimes been called the peace dividend. And so I got a chance to talk to the leaders in the area and say, will you help us pull this together? And so after I was done with that and was at Stanford again, teaching and also teaching at the University of Wisconsin, where I taught about the Africa issue, I got a call saying, hey, would you talk to me? We represent something called the Campaign for Nature. And this is something that is funded by Hans-Jörg Wyss, who's a billionaire originally from Switzerland, who really loves national parks and has become alarmed about what's known as the biodiversity crisis. And I was called and they said, well, we understand you know a lot about Rwanda and Congo. We need to get all these countries in the world to help us move forward on this issue. Could you help us with some of the African countries? And I said, sure, I'll sign up what you want me to do. Basically what they're doing is trying to implement, kind of like the Paris Climate Accord. This is the way to think about it. The Convention on Biodiversity, the CBD. Okay, it's a treaty. Back in Rio de Janeiro in 1992, there were 3 treaties that were formulated there. One is the climate one that we all know about, that led to the Paris Accord. Another is a desertification one, which is one about preventing further erosion of areas, particularly in Africa, where the desert swallows up good areas. And the third is the Convention on Biodiversity. Of course, the University of Wisconsin-Madison is one of the greatest universities in the world with regard to this subject. I kept, wherever I went, working on this job in Africa, no matter where I went, there was somebody from UW-Madison who was like the expert. If you go to a national park, the guy in charge of the lions in Rwanda is a guy from Madison doing his PhD. So really fun connection between my alma mater and this work.
Senator Feingold, let me interrupt you a minute. I forgot to tell people how they can ask you questions. And so if people will look at the bottom of the screen on chat, and they'll see on the right side will be a white panel. And if you would put your questions there, and then when the senator has finished speaking, I will ask the questions. So I'm sorry I forgot to mention that, and I gave you time to get a drink of water. So anyway, carry on.
Thank you, Helen. So, I said, look, I'd try to help. And as Melanie correctly pointed out, the goal here that was established by these various groups that are trying to persuade the countries to come together in Kunming, China in October on this. It was supposed to be last October, but it got delayed because of COVID-19. The goal here is to convince the countries of the world to sign up for a commitment that the world, for the planet, 30% of the planet, both water and land, would be preserved or made protected by 2030. It's a very ambitious goal. Currently, we're not anywhere near that. It's about 15% on land and maybe less than 10% on the ocean. But this is a serious commitment, and there's a lot of activity to try to get that done. And what we've done is to try to identify countries who will sort of be champions of nature. There were champion countries that helped get the Paris Accord in place. And as you know, John Kerry is going to meet with the Secretary General of the UN to bring us back into the Paris Accord in a few days. Well, this is the same kind of thing, where you get countries to take a lead role and to try to sign up people to do this. So what is this based on? Well, it's based on the fact that under the Convention on Biodiversity, every 10 years there's supposed to be a convention of the parties. And these goals are set. So the goals were set in Japan for 2020, back in 2010. And it was like 15% and 17% for land and water. But what's happened since then is the scientists are telling us the situation with regard to biodiversity and extinction has become much more dire. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But they're raising the alarm. This is a multilateral treaty, and almost every country in the world has become part of this treaty. The treaty is legally binding. It doesn't mean it's always enforced, but it is legally binding on the countries. Here's the crazy thing. There's only one major country in the world out of 190 that's not a party to the treaty. I think you know what it is. The one you're sitting in, United States. And that's because Jesse Helms and the various right-wingers on the Foreign Relations Committee, when I was a young member in the 1990s, started killing treaties, like the Law of the Sea. We didn't ratify the Law of the Sea, the Law to Protect the Children's Treaty. And this one, the Convention on Biodiversity, was not ratified. So we are technically, even though we're involved in this, we as a country are not a part of this accord. So that is an amazing fact, but the whole effort continues, and it has continued for many years. But now we're coming to this big moment where we have to find out if they can really put this thing into a new level. The scientists on here may know that the scientific term for what's happening during this area is known as the Anthropocene. It's the first time that there is an extinction, although there have been several, where it's caused by humans, that it's human activity that is creating this possibility and likelihood of severe loss of biodiversity and of life, basically loss of life of all kinds on the planet. So this treaty is in theory organized and followed by a secretariat for the UN, which is in Montreal, and they have scientific arms and strategic arms, but every country is expected to submit a report that you can see online on their website, saying how far they've gotten with preserving the natural areas in their country. And here's a point I want to make clear. When I say 30 by 30, that doesn't mean each country has to do 30%. Because some countries, it's not so hard, like Canada, because it has enormous area. But a country like Rwanda, which is very densely populated, would be impossible. So that's an international goal. And each country has to come up with its own plans. It totally scares countries off if they think that each country has to achieve that. It is a global goal. And what will happen in Kunming, hopefully, and I hope to be there, is that this will all come together for the 15th Convention of the Parties. Every 2 years, just like with the Climate Accord, they've had 25 of those. They come together and they try to move the ball forward for an issue like this. Now, there have been criticisms of this treaty. Some say it's actually too pro global South, that it's not sufficiently understanding of the countries in the North and the West. Others say that it's gone soft, that it isn't really enforced. And the other is that it's not clear to people that it's really supposed to cover all forms of life, not just tigers and elephants, as exciting as that is for many people. It's bacteria, it's fungi, it's peatlands. These are critical parts of the ecosystem that have to be protected. And so what really sort of got this issue moving, along with the fact that the climate issue has become much more prominent, at least prior to the COVID thing, is that in May of 2019, a huge report was issued by what's called the IPBES, which is a huge group of scientists sponsored by the UN, essentially saying that the threat to biodiversity, the loss of life of all kinds of living beings, of all kinds, is, quote, at least as great as the climate crisis. This is something that Sir Robert Watson of England has said. They talk about the loss of forest to creating farms for palm oil and soy and cattle. And overall, the biggest factor here, although climate change is important, is food, is the food system, trying to produce food, and especially industrial farming. And of course, since human civilization began, there's been an enormous loss in life, in the term wild animals, 85% down, marine animals, 80% down, plants, 50% down, fish, 14% down. And then in recent years, some of the statistics about the collapse of insects in Europe, bees and others, 37% down, particularly amphibians, 61% less. And what this report said was up to 1 million species could face extinction in the not too distant future. For those of us from this part of the world, North America, since 1970, since that day when they told me to go outside in Janesville Craig High School and pick up the garbage, pick up the litter, we've lost 30% of all our birds in North America. And actually, it's a lot of the more common birds. It's not just the rare birds. And so, there's been a reaction. There's been a movement on this. And it's even reflected in one of the more, I'm not going to say radical, but, populist movements in England called the Extinction Rebellion, because it's beginning to become part of the consciousness along with the climate issue. So to be clear, what are the main causes of this? It's important to understand this because it relates to, but is different from climate change. The number one cause of the loss of biodiversity is the use of land and water. Clearing areas for agriculture, using water for fishing. The second is the direct exploitation of organisms, logging, hunting, fishing. The third is climate change. Climate change can and does, for example, when you hear about the loss of the beautiful coral reefs, the loss of the color, the bleaching, that's a loss of biodiversity. What causes it? It's the warming of the water, because it kills the fungi and the other creatures that live on the coral. And once they die, then the coral itself can't survive and becomes white and ultimately dies. The fourth biggest cause is the one that got us all going on this with Gaylord Nelson, the one we used to talk about, pollution. Remember, it was always about pollution. Well, pollution's still very important, but it's actually fourth. And then fifth is invasive alien species. You know all about this if you're from the Great Lakes region, the zebra mussels. And if we ever end up with one of these Asian carp getting into Lake Michigan, it could take eliminate all life in Lake Michigan. So invasive species are an issue here and in other places as well. So it sounds really bad, but what the scientists also tell us is there are solutions. It's not necessarily too late. We can do things like better protect pollinators and tighter controls on invasive species and a public awareness of the need to preserve more areas. But we are getting close to a tipping point. And that is why I and others have joined this effort. And how in the world are we going to get all the countries to agree to this? Well, we're in high gear now trying to line up all the different countries. And some aren't as helpful, as you may guess, under Mr. Bolsonaro in Brazil. He's terrible. he's basically encouraged the destruction of biodiversity, even though they've been having fires and others in the Amazon. We worry about other countries not being helpful, such as Russia. Interestingly, though, China, even though it may not be perfect on this, sees an opportunity to become a key player and have real credibility on this. So they're hosting this conference in China, and as part of their, of course, goal for international leadership in general areas. One of my jobs was to create what was called a global steering committee. And my job was to line up former world leaders, people that are no longer in office, but who would commit to promoting this 30 by 30. So I was able to get Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who was the first woman president ever in Africa from Liberia, and who was a Packer fan because she went to Madison Business College. She's part of it. Zippy Livni, the former foreign minister and acting prime minister of Israel. Mary Robinson, the first woman president of Ireland and a great climate expert. Olaf Ragnarsson, who is the former president of Iceland. We have experts from Southeast Asia. So it's an exciting group, and we are trying to get publicity and awareness of this issue to encourage other countries to become part of it. Now, one of the most important parts of this that wasn't completely apparent in the first 10 years of the treaty was the need to understand the role of indigenous peoples in these situations. You know, back in the day when the Belgians created some of the first national parks, they just removed the people that had always lived there. There was no real respect or understanding that not only did these people have a right to live, and they had lived there for thousands of years, but they know the most about the biodiversity. They know the most about how to handle it. So there's been a strong change in encouraging opportunities where you might preserve an area, but not remove people from it, but form an agreement with the people living in the area that they would continue to have it be their area, but agree not to sell it off to mining interests or whatever it might be. So this is one of the ways in which this treaty has evolved. And, you know, naturally, as you go forward with something like this, the biggest concerns are, okay, are we going to have to, how are we going to feed our people if we have to do this? Who's going to pay for this? And when you go down to Uganda and you tell President Museveni he needs to do this, he's going to say, fine, I like animals too, and I like wildlife too, but I got to feed my people. And so the question is, where's the money going to come from? And it's not going to come from those countries. And then there is the need to show respect for indigenous peoples. There are many aspects of this that are potential pitfalls and dilemmas that I'll just briefly mention so we can get to some of the questions. But, you know, it's how do you count this? I mean, you know, how do you count the area? Is it like a backyard in a city? Maybe not right away. But there are different models of how area is counted. You can't just have a country say, all right, here's this field, we're going to call it a natural area. If there's no management, if there's no effort to take care of it, you know, just as I know from living across the Pheasant Branch Conservancy, the management is a huge job if an area is going to continue to be safe and work well. So that is one of the issues. Another one is, how does this affect food security? Another is, which I've mentioned, is the tendency to focus on the sexy mammals that people find exciting, the big five and all that kind of thing, as opposed to understanding that this issue is at least as much about microbes, fungi, coral, and many other earthworms and other aspects of nature that are absolutely critical. And there are tensions. You know, there's a competition between those countries and people that are concerned about the oceans and the waters. You know, the French and the English in particular are very concerned about the maritime aspect, and others are more concerned about the land. Question is, you know, what is restoration? What does that involve? Who's paying for it? What is a full restoration? What counts as restoration of an area? And then I like to say, then there's the whole irony of catastrophes, that sometimes catastrophes lead to greater wilderness. I don't know if you saw that incredible, I think it might have been HBO program on Chernobyl, where there was a terrible disaster there. Well, apparently if you go there now, it is the most incredible wildlife situation because it's abandoned, and the animals and the wolves and everything is in this lush, beautiful way because of a catastrophe. And the same thing happened in Angola, where they had a 30-year war, and now there is this area in Angola, where nobody's been for so long because of landmines. And I guess it's one of the most incredible replenishments of diversity, of biodiversity in the history of modern history. So you have to sort of, nobody's going to advocate for that, but that's an interesting piece. Now, the final piece that I want to mention, a couple of final pieces. How does this relate to the climate issue? One thing I worry about is there could be a competition here. A lot of people are working the climate issue. Of course, I care deeply about it and was just on the phone with some of Al Gore's people yesterday. These issues don't have to be competitive. They should be collaborative. A great example is, as I mentioned, the coral reefs issue. Another one goes the other way. The forest in Congo is considered the second lung of the planet after the Amazon. Now, if you cut down those trees, loss of biodiversity. If you gut the peatlands that are in those areas, that releases the CO2. That is a huge sink for CO2 that helps prevent climate change. If you lose that biodiversity, it affects the climate. So a lot of us are saying, look, the way to look at this is these are not in competition because there's competition for funding and so on, that they should work hand in hand. And so one of my goals is in the coming year, as I work on this is just a part-time thing that I'm doing, is to promote this. Now, one of the things that I'm excited about is that the new administration has committed the United States to the 30 by 30. Joe Biden has done that. Whether he could get the treaty through the Senate is another question, but I think he's showing that he's interested in this. And in fact, he appointed Secretary of the Interior, Native American, Deborah Haaland, who is one of my Global Steering Committee members. She had to resign now, but she is a strong backer of this 30 by 30. And of course, with her Native American background, she understands very well culturally the issue of the need to protect biodiversity, which Indigenous peoples are often ahead of. So it's an exciting time to have the United States rejoin the rest of the world. And I think this one, because it's a relatively new issue, will be one where Americans can engage to get our young people, like they're doing in climate change, to bring this awareness. It reminds me of when I was the chairman of the Africa subcommittee. And I thought I knew everything about Africa. I didn't really think that, but I thought I knew most of the things that I should know. And then my little daughter, Ellen, comes home from Middleton High School, and she's now the curator of the coin collection at the Smithsonian, but at that time she was just a little kid. She comes home and she goes, "What are you going to do? What are you going to do about the lost children in Uganda?" And I said, "What's that?" And it's because there was a program identifying what the Lord's Resistance Army was doing to children in northern Uganda that I became aware of this and ended up writing the legislation that has been the model for dealing with this problem. Is because my kid came home and said, "Dad, how come you're not doing anything about this?" So let me conclude the formal remarks with just two quotes, one a little more lofty and one a little more fun. The first one is from the Pope. And I'll tell you something. To me, the Pope, in many respects, has been a moral leader of the world for several years, particularly on the environment. And he put out a document in September, Catechesis, Healing the World. And this is how he speaks of our natural world. We must also extend this care to our common home, to the earth and every creature. All forms of life are interconnected, and our health depends on that of the ecosystems that God created and entrusted to us to care for. Abusing them, on the other hand, is a grave sin that damages us and harms us and makes us sick. The best antidote against this misuse of our common home, the Pope says, is contemplation. But how come? Isn't there a vaccine for this, for the common home, so as to not set it aside? What is the antidote against the sickness of not taking care of our common home? It is contemplation. If someone has not learned to stop and admire something beautiful, we should not be surprised if he or she treats everything as an object to be used and abused without scruple. And I think that's a beautiful way to talk about the need for biodiversity. The other one's a letter I got from a little kid on December 2nd, 1992, after I'd been elected to the Senate, but had not yet been sworn in. She wrote to me Dear Senator-elect Feingold, if any laws come up, OP, about saving the rainforest, please vote in favor of them. Without the rainforest, there would be no KNOW coffee, and no KNOW rubber, and no KNOW gum, or not KNOT any chocolate, CHOCLET. A lot of animals would be extincted too. I am glad you won, ONE, from Emily. And somehow I kept this thing and it's coming in. So anyway, thank you for letting me go on and on. I care about this issue. I think most people do. And it's just really something I knew nothing about 2 years ago, really. And now I find it exciting and it's something people can get involved in. So I'm happy to answer questions.
We have a question about your contributor, Mr. Weiss, you mentioned, who's contributed $1 billion. How does he want that money to be spent in this campaign?
Only a small part of that total is being used for this particular advocacy effort, very small. But he also is putting the money into helping to create the funding that's going to be needed from wealthy countries, from wealthy people to pay for all this. It's going to cost tens of billions of dollars a year to be able to move forward on this. So he is for years paid for, bought national parks. I mean, my wife and I had a chance to be in Chile just before this COVID, and we went to Patagonia. And the reason that has been so successful in Chile is that the man and the husband and wife who were North Face, he actually died sadly in an accident, in a boating accident. But he and his wife went to Chile and basically said to the government, we're going to buy these ranches here in Patagonia and turn them into national parks. So there are these wealthy people who, such as Hans-Jörg Wyss, who care about this, along with the governments and the UN and others that are trying to provide the funding. So that's, it's basically it's not just buying the land, it's how do you manage it? So when I was in Rwanda, I met with the head of forestry there, great guy, and he was talking about how they're expanding their reforestation program. But he looked at me and he said, Ambassador, you must understand, we don't have a school of forestry here. We sit here in Madison with the National Forest Service. They don't have a way to train people to do forestry. So there needs to be funding for the personnel and the expertise in order to be able to properly manage natural areas. So that's the kind of things that I believe he's doing, but I don't know him personally, and I don't know what he's going to be doing with the rest of the money. I do know that he's supporting our effort.
Can you talk a little bit about the protocol that will be at the convention this year? Will NGOs be there? Will they have votes, or is it only countries, or how does that work?
Well, only countries will have votes in the end, but there will be an enormous presence from NGOs. And in fact, what's going on now is there are regional meetings leading up to this, where these agreements and concerns are developed for proposals to be considered by the countries in Kunming. So, one of the things is, how are they going to decide what counts and what doesn't as part of the 30%? What are the protocols on that? So those are being worked out. And there is a very heavy presence of NGOs at all of these. And of course, as I've indicated, many of these people are connected with the University of Wisconsin-Madison, as well as Milwaukee. But no, strong presence, but not a vote.
And what about in our own country? Do we give a certain amount of support to this campaign? I mean, did the last administration, will this administration? Or?
Well, first of all, we're not part of the treaty. So we're not, in terms of the Campaign for Nature, that's just privately funded. But in terms of the Convention on Biodiversity, we're not even a party to it. But I think the Biden administration is going to devote some resources to it. And I'm hoping they create an office of biodiversity in the White House, just like they have an office of climate change. And there's been a bill introduced in Congress. It was first introduced by former Senator Tom Udall, and it's going to be reintroduced to commit to the 30 by 30 for the United States and to help fund it. But it's only a piece of legislation, and whether or not I think it would get through the House, but not clear if it could get through the Senate, especially if the filibuster applies to it. So we're not there yet, but it's better than it was a few months ago.
Yeah, recently Bill Gates has written a new book about climate change. Of course, that's his big effort now. Is he involved in this campaign with you?
Not yet, but what I am hoping is that a number of these powerhouses in different spheres that are devoting a lot of money to things will see the advantage of combining these efforts. So to my knowledge, he's not involved with this, but my sense is that he probably would be sympathetic, as long as it's not seen as something that's siphoning off effort on climate change. I mean, let me give you an example. There is a risk that some of the big companies that do things that aren't good for the environment or that create climate problems, maybe they would say, well, let's talk about biodiversity instead, and we'll buy up area and preserve it so they don't have to do what they need to do to stop causing carbon problems. So we have to make sure that it doesn't become a way to sort of get away from the climate thing. That would be terrible. So that's one of the challenges.
There's been some discussion before about increasing the situation of the diversity on the high seas. Has there been any movement in that area?
Yeah, this is as much about the seas as it is about the land. There's overfishing problems on the coast of Africa. I mean, I've been, and within Africa, when I worked on the Great Lakes issue, there's a country called Burundi, which is one of the tiniest countries in the world. It's even smaller than Rwanda, but it's on Lake Tanganyika. And so when I went there, I thought, well, okay, why is this country the least food secure country in the world? I mean, it looks to me like there's this, lake with fish. Well, it's completely overfished. And commercial fishing has taken away the fish, and there's also sanitation problems. So people aren't even able to eat the fish. So we have to stop the overfishing. As you know, Chinese trawlers and other exploitation on the coast of Africa is a huge issue. So when I was in Africa a year ago, and there was actually talk about COVID, and they had this COVID stuff in the room, but I didn't understand how serious it was. It was exactly a year ago. I went to the main session, and the main session was an African coalition about the blue aspect, the ocean part, because so many of the African countries, of course, have coastal area. And that will be one of the most important battlegrounds for this because of overfishing and exploitation. But that's something that, those areas can be restored usually. It's usually not permanent if proper methods are used.
Are the NGOs like the World Wildlife Fund and the Nature Conservancy, are they involved in this intimately?
Very much so. National Geographic is our biggest partner. But yes, they are all interested, involved, and I like to think are part of a broader coalition. Our particular mission is to line up countries through their political systems to endorse this. But some of those other organizations, of course, are so involved with international efforts on this. I mean, the range of situations is just phenomenal, of course. I mean, whether it's the coastline in Goa, India, or whether it's the salmon in the northwestern United States, or tigers in Bangladesh. I mean, these are challenges everywhere where these different groups try to be involved.
Are there countries that have just refused to become involved in it?
Ones that have been the biggest aggressive sort of opponents on this are primarily Russia and Brazil. And the problem with Brazil is that they are they're like the 400-pound gorilla in South America. They're pretty rough on some of the other countries there that are really pretty good about this, like Argentina. One of our leading members of our great global steering committee is Susana Malcorra, former foreign minister of Argentina. So we, at these regional meetings, we have to fight Brazil's attempt to undercut this. And we worry about the influence that other countries might have. For example, we're worried about South Africa a little bit. South Africa is critical here it's easily one of the most powerful countries in Africa. I think the president's a pretty positive guy, the new, more reformed president, Ramaphosa. But we're using other leading African leaders to try to get to him to take this on, because we think the Russians and others are trying to persuade South Africa to block what we're trying to do here. And we're trying to engage Indonesia, which hasn't been terribly helpful and is one of the most biodiverse places on the planet, with 17,000 islands and amazing biodiversity, water and land. But they're not necessarily on board either. This is where we're hoping that China will really be a positive player. If the United States can get back in this game, which it completely was not doing under Trump, and even not so much under Obama because he was blocked by Congress, and if we can get China to be genuinely engaged, that combination in this context could be pretty strong. But if we don't, we have countries like Russia and Brazil who are trying to screw things up.
Hmm. Well, it'll be interesting to see, if they're going to be the only country left out, Brazil and Russia, you'd wonder if they would want to be outliers like that,
I mean, they're technically part of this treaty. They're signed on to it, unlike us. But, the proof's in the pudding, of course. Devil's in the details.
Yeah. So where will you hold your next convention after China?
I don't think they've decided that. It's every 10 years. So they'll probably announce that then. So, but there's these gatherings every 2 years. So the one that was held 2 years ago was held in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. So I'll have to check and see when the next one will be.
Yeah.
I'm just hoping I can go to this thing. Obviously, it wasn't possible this past year, but I'm hoping to get the COVID-19 under control and the planet can come together and try to do what was done in Paris in 2015, only on this issue.
Yeah. Someone is interested in knowing a little bit more about the Constitution Society.
All right, let me switch gears very dramatically from Kunming, China to the United States. So as Melanie pointed out, 40 years ago, a number of very conservative students at Harvard and Yale Law School were sick and tired of all the liberals that they were in class with, and they didn't like the Warren Court, and they didn't like the Roe v. Wade decision and others, and they didn't like it that Judge Bork wasn't confirmed for the Supreme Court, and they decided to create a group that would, quote, make conservatives comfortable to talk with each other. And then they formulated a plan over 40 years to try to take over the federal courts. And they have succeeded. They have completely stolen the United States Supreme Court. They have put hundreds of very conservative, young, ideological judges on the courts. So what we say as an organization is they've stolen the courts, and that's what I believe. And so 20 years ago, a group of progressive young lawyers created this group called the American Constitution Society. And the idea was to counter the right in this regard. Frankly, because the Constitution, the Federal Society is backed by enormous money from the Koch brothers and people like that, they have far greater resources. But this is a strong organization that is actually very grassroots. We have 200 student chapters in 200 law schools. We have 50 lawyer chapters. One of the best ones is right here in Madison, led by Mark Mandel, who is leading it. And we are seeing the potential of this now, because what we did, because there was sort of a failure under Clinton and Obama to really make this a priority. Now we spent the last 2 years, and I just started this job a year ago, so we includes people that were there before me. We have 50 working groups across the country. One's in Wisconsin, and they have gone to the community. 2 African-American groups, the NAACP, 2 Latinx groups, 2 LGBTQ groups, and said, okay, what kind of person would you like to practice law in front of? What kind of federal judges would you like to see? So they generated lists of these individuals. And by the time the Biden administration was declared the winner, Biden was declared the winner, we were able to send, I was able to send 400 names to him of people that have been vetted we think they should appoint to the federal bench. This was written up extensively in the New York Times and the Washington Post, and our effort was credited by the Nation magazine as a progressive hero effort during the past year. And so we are now trying to reverse or be ready to begin reversing the damage that has been done by the Federalist Society and the right by really, in my view, corrupting the independence of our courts. We don't use litmus tests. We respect the role of the president and the Senate in this process, unlike the Federalist Society. Trump just handed the whole thing over to him. And so this is what we do. We have some of the leading academics in the country are part of our group, a lot of major practicing lawyers, including those in Wisconsin. The Wisconsin Plaintiffs Bar has been very supportive of us. So it's the only real national grassroots across the board progressive legal organization. There are others that are, specific to civil rights or civil liberties, but we're the only one that's sort of an umbrella group that does this. And I became president a year ago, supposed to be running the organization out of Washington, but we all know what happened. So I'm here in Middleton in my office, running the organization from here across from Pheasant Branch Conservancy. But it's an important group, and I'm trying to raise the visibility of it. And so I appreciate the question.
Well, at least you don't have far to go to your office every day, so
no complaints, no commuting.
To be said about that, yeah. Is there anything I think we sort of asked you a lot of questions. Is there any final thing you'd like to say to us about what we might can do or what we should be doing to help you or what?
Yeah, I'd like to see people sort of try to connect to this issue at the local level. One of the exciting things that was going on before COVID was, of course, the effort by young people across the planet, starting in sort of September at the UN of 2019. And it was really going. And people were every Friday going to their town halls and having a quiet protest, talking about the climate. I would love to see people get back to that once COVID is over and include this biodiversity crisis. I mean, young people have this awful feeling. By the way, I kept calling this guy Mark Mandel. It's Jeff Mandel. I apologize. Anyway, they have this awful feeling that our generations are leaving them in this mess of a frightening climate and the loss of biodiversity. So the energy that can come from young people, if older people like us, show an interest in this, I think there's going to be a lot of student interest in it. Supporting that grassroots kind of activism, in a pleasant way, in a fun way. I remember on my campaign, sometimes people that couldn't do other things because they were at home and older, but they made cookies for our volunteers. That they came down and helped out in the office. I mean, that's whatever your level. To indicate to people that you just want to help any way you can and make it fun and exciting. This is an issue that can get people excited. People love the planet. People love natural life, and especially our younger generations. This is a very inviting issue once you get involved in it. I didn't expect to, but I've found it to be one of my favorite things I've ever done. And I think it's contagious if others get involved. So I'm hoping post-COVID, I think it'll work best.
Well, certainly you bring a lot of passion to the cause, and that'll be a tremendous help. So we really do thank you for taking time to be with us this evening and for answering all our many questions. And let us know in the future anything else that comes up you think we can do better. We'd like to do that too. So anyway, welcome home. It's nice to have you back in Wisconsin. And even though, it's because of the pandemic, but, some good things have come out of that too. So thank you very much. Thanks to everybody who joined us, and good night.